Thanks everyone for coming to the talk. It's really nice to see everyone here. So I'm Yoni Bresley. Nice to meet you all. How do I use this thing? I'm Yoni. I'm the audio designer on Kill Knight. I've been at PlaySide for about a year now. During that time, I've worked on Kill Knight. Before that, I worked on Desync and a bunch of mobile games, sort of freelancing. Desync it's a PC game. I've always thought of it as the spiritual precursor to Kill Knight. Kill Knight is kind of like Desync 2.0 because Sean, the lead game designer of Kill Knight, also was the lead game designer of Desync, and they share a lot of commonalities, and we worked on both games together. Outside of that, I've got a background in electronic music and live performance, which I think sort of informs the way I approach working on Kill Knight. So for anyone that doesn't know, what is Kill Knight? It's a really hardcore top-down isometric action shooter where you wield an arsenal of devastating weaponry to destroy lots of enemies and master a lot of intricate mechanics. Here's a little video of what Kill Knight looks like. Yeah, so it's a pretty intense game, as you can see. In this talk, I want to go through the challenges of working on Kill Knight and what I did to overcome them. It was a particularly challenging game to work on, I reckon. It was a new experience for me, and I learned a lot throughout the process, and hopefully I can share some of my experiences working on the game. So I guess, as with pretty much any game, the first phase is sort of aligning with the vision, understanding what the game is about, what it's meant to be. And that was no different for me. So I want to talk about the high-level vision of Kill Knight. So we want it to be a skill-based power fantasy, meaning that you have to play it's a very skillful game, requires a lot of skill. Hard to learn, harder to master. We didn't want it to be easy to learn. We wanted it to be hard to learn because that also is part of the immersion of playing as the Kill Knight, who is going through this eternal damnation, basically, in the abyssal keep. Synesthesia and the zone, which are particularly relevant to me as an audio person. We wanted the audio and visuals to really coalesce into a really vibrant experience, vibrant, intense experience. And the zone kind of means we want players to be in this flow state when they're playing, really locked in, where any blink and any wrong move will likely result in their death. Immersive Otherworld, we wanted it to be an immersive experience where it's kind of unlike anything that you've played before. For us, the success metric was to be as fun as possible as game as we could make, which is a really awesome place to be as a designer as well, to have that as like the number one metric of where you want to be driving the game. So I feel lucky to have worked on a game like that. So Kill Knight should feel like an 80s arcade game that aliens from the future made. That's kind of like the high level overview of the aesthetic vision. I think it's a pretty interesting sort of elevator pitch, you could call it, and I'll go into why now. So yeah, the identity's still being figured out. So it was challenging because I came onto the project early, and unusually early, I'd say, as an audio person. So what that meant is that the game was still being figured out. The vision, it hadn't really fully formed. The lead game director, Sean, knew where we were going, but not really how we were going to get there. And I guess that's part of my job and the whole team's job to try and figure out how we're going to get there. Audio is 50% of the experience. That's something that Sean, the lead game designer, would often say to me, which is really cool. It's cool to work with someone who really respects audio as a craft and really wants it to be like a fundamental pillar of the game experience. Yeah, ultimately it's a collaborative endeavor. So it's not just about me coming onto the project and like executing someone else's vision, even though it can sort of sometimes feel like that initially. But the main thing is that I understand the vision so then I can take it on myself and like evolve the ideas further. So yeah, Kill Knight was a challenging game to work on because it had a lot of seemingly contradictory ideas in the vision. I want to go through a few of them. So we want it to be this otherworldly experience. I mean, if it's made by aliens from the future, like we don't want it to be like anything that we know, ideally. But at the same time, we want it to be grounded in things that we do know. We want it to feel like this really tactile, real experience that players were touching. Inherently, arcade games are pretty silly, but also we wanted it to feel really serious at the same time. And I'll go into a little bit later on how we sort of went about achieving that. It's an 80s arcade game, so we wanted it to feel retro, be kind of a nod to old arcade games, but we also wanted it to feel super slick and modern at the same time. Same with readability and sensory assault. I mean, you probably saw already from that video early on, it is like there's a lot going on, and we wanted it to feel like there was a lot going on, but at the same time it's really important for us that sounds are like extremely readable, that everything in the game was readable so that essentially players can use their skill to interpret what's going on in the game and therefore do well at the game. And there are a bunch more others that digging into these, it was interesting to try and wrap my head around what all of this meant, because there's a lot of like interesting ideas but subjective and seemingly opposing ideas. So yeah, this is probably the moral of the story for Kill Knight. It was challenging, as I said. I've probably said that quite a few times already. So we needed a unique soundscape for Kill Knight. Obviously, Kill Knight's a new IP, and we wanted it to really feel like its own identity. We wanted to feel different from other arcade games, but also we wanted Kill Knight to just have its own vision, essentially. But the other reason, which is really important, is that the vision that I sort of went through a little bit before demanded uniqueness from the soundscape. If we're going to be doing something that's some game that's made by aliens from the future that we can't even comprehend, obviously we would really like it to not sound like anything we know. Yeah, and unique is never an easy thing to do. I mean, I think ultimately everyone wants to make something unique when they're making art, but it's one of the hardest things to do, especially with the amount of content and the amount of games. Whatever industry you're working in, there's just so much out there. So it's a real challenge to make something unique these days. So we identified pretty early on that because we wanted it to sound like nothing that we recognize, we immediately need to avoid all of these tropes, because all of these tropes kind of make you think of something that you already know. I'll play a few sound effects from tropes like this just to give you an example. So all cool sounds, but for me at least, they remind me of something very understandable. So not understandable, but something that I've sort of know already. And this is something we really wanted to avoid in Kill Knight. Oops. So yeah, this is another thing that happened a lot of the time on Kill Knight. I guess everything that I've spoken to up until this point is quite subjective. A lot of these words and these descriptions, And it's very easy to interpret them one way, but for someone else to have a different interpretation of what that means. And that was a very strong part of Kill Knight, the process of creating the game. So I guess the way I got around that is by quite a lot comparing my interpretations of what certain things mean with the team and the lead game designer, Sean. So I've got a few, I will go from left to right here. I'm just going to play 4 snippets of music in a row. And these are all things that came up early on in development when we were talking about otherworldly in the context of Kill Knight, and you'll see that they're extremely different. Yeah, so a lot of different ideas there. It was really important that we sort of aligned with what something like otherworldly actually means, because it's a hard to define word, and this is a way that we often did. Oops. So I guess at this point, I've aligned with the vision to as much as I possibly can. So it was really important that I start owning the process and taking my interpretation and evolving it and bringing my own ideas to the project. So the next part is about building a reference bank, which was also quite important for me personally to get a better understanding of what kind of sounds we want to have in the game. What do we want the game to actually sound like? So what am I searching for when I'm trying to gather references? I guess any sounds really that sort of have interesting layering or timing within the sounds that sound unique to me. Uniqueness, again, is ultimately a subjective thing, so it's a personal thing for me, and at the same time trying to align my interpretation with the team's. Also, particularly for how sounds feel, like the physicality, we wanted Kill Knight to be a particularly impactful game, so that was something that I was looking out for quite a bit as well. Probably the most obvious place to start with references was our game references. We had a lot of really cool games that inspired Kill Knight, and so that was a really good place to start diving into. Ultimately, they had a lot of good things when it came to atmosphere, tone, game mechanics, soundscape as well, but none of them were complete representations of what we wanted to do, especially for the soundscape. I've got a few examples of some of these references, videos. So I'll play Devil Daggers is a small indie game that sort of made a big impact, I'd say, in certain communities. It's just like a really unique, intense experience. Here's a bit of a snippet from the game. Yeah, pretty intense experience. I don't know if for anyone that knows Devil Daggers as well, they made a sequel called Hyperdemon, which was about 100 times more intense than that. But yeah, it has this really unique sound design, which I like, but also specifically it felt kind of retro, but also otherworldly at the same time. That was something that I really took on, but ultimately it wasn't exactly what we wanted. The weapons sort of took a backseat in the mix. It was first person perspective, and it was just a bit of a different vibe at the end of the day. Next one is Doom Eternal, a much more well-known game, but equally amazing game. Let's play a snippet from that. Yeah, so you can kind of see where we're going with Kill Knight a little bit in terms of the intensity and that sort of thing. Doom, I mean, it's so punchy when you play Doom. It really feels like it's smacking you in the face with like the audio and every aspect of it. So that was something that I really liked about that game in relation to Kill Knight. But ultimately, it's still pretty sci-fi. A lot of the UI and the weapon sounds, it's got a very sci-fi feel to it. Music is a different style. So not complete representation. Next game is Returnal, one of the best sounding games I've ever played. Really amazing sounding game. Very otherworldly, amazingly mixed, but also quite sci-fi at the end of the day. A bit too serious for what we wanted, but a lot of ideas worth getting. So if you don't know what's out there, you don't know what's unique. I mean, it kind of seems in a way like an obvious, it sort of seems like an obvious statement, but at the same time, it's not. I think it's really, really important to, if you're trying to create something unique, to sort of have as broad an understanding of what's out there as you can, so you can make better informed decisions about what it is you're doing. So for me, I mean, I've kind of always, particularly from my electronic music passion, I've always really been interested in finding something that I've never heard before. So naturally, I've kind of always been doing this, but it was particularly important to do that more for Kill Knight because we were trying to create something new and interesting. I also looked at a lot of sound effects libraries online, game sound effects libraries. I found that they were really, really tropey. This image at the top is from, I think it's from Sonis. I can't remember which one it is, but there wasn't a single category when it comes to like non-realistic sounds that didn't fall under one of those tropes that I had on one of the earlier slides. So it was quite difficult, and that was pretty much the same across the board. So it's really hard trying to find sound effects libraries that didn't immediately make me think of something that we didn't want to think of. And I realized I can't just rely on these libraries, at least without doing something to them myself. I also had a look at music production libraries, which similarly have their own tropes. But it was interesting seeing that they sort of exist within this other sphere of tropes compared to sound effects libraries. I mean, game sound effects libraries might have sci-fi and fantasy, whatever, whereas music production libraries would have like dubstep and trap or reggae, whatever it is. But I feel like in just the way that they're categorized differently, it allows for sort of different exploration of ideas, which is something that I found quite interesting. But ultimately, music production libraries, they don't have variations in sound, and they're quite inconsistent. So again, it was still, I couldn't rely on it. It was really important that I stored references of things that I was finding along the way, just to keep record and sort of check in with the team to make sure we're on the same page. It was a good source of inspiration for me, and it was equally important, I reckon, to get references of what we didn't want to do as it was with what we did want to do. So I guess from here I have a lot of ideas. This sort of subjective vision felt a bit less scary to me. I did realize as well, like I said, that I can't rely on commercial sound effects libraries and things like that. So I needed to get creative. So how was I going to do that? I want to talk about now actually designing the aesthetic, and I'll go through some examples of what I did on Kill Knight. So yeah, I guess at this point, everything I've done is kind of like thinking and talking and researching, but there's only so far that can get you. Obviously, there comes a time where you just need to start doing it and trying things out. So that's what I did. There's a lot of experimentation. These are some of the tools that I used on the project. I was just kind of trying to use whatever I was comfortable with or whatever seemed to do something unique, or unique to me at least. Tried a lot of shit, failed a lot. It really was, there was so much iteration and experimenting on Kill Knight to try and figure out an aesthetic that felt good for us. So designing the UI and menu sound effects. The UI, pretty cool in Kill Knight. I figured that it was a great place for us to inject a bit of this arcade energy into the sound aesthetic of Kill Knight. We wanted to feel chunky and rewarding as well. A lot of menus and such, they have like little beeps and just like fairly quiet, unobtrusive sounds. But we really wanted ours to sort of take center stage and be interesting and rewarding and sort of hit you hard. I also think it's a really great place to add a lot of interest because it's like the first time user experience. It's the first thing that people see when they open up the game. So you really want to wow them, ideally. We wanted to make a good first impression. So the reward-based sound effects, and what I mean by that is any sound that's kind of rewarding the player or plays when the player is being rewarded for doing something. I was sort of just experimenting with synthesizers and just using tools. And I came across this particular sound, which by itself sounds not So yeah, by itself it sounds not that interesting. But pitch keeps playing twice. Pitch down 3 octaves and adding an extra note to make a chord, and it sounds like this. So that was I found that was a happy little accident, as Bob Ross would like to say. I didn't expect that, and that just came through playing around basically. And from that point, I just sort of added layers and processed it a bit further, and that created the Sever Mode unlocked sound, which is kind of, Sever Mode is when you've beaten the game, then you unlock the final challenge, which is essentially playing all 5 levels in a row without a break, which is pretty crazy, but this is what it sounded like. So from that point, I took that original synth sound and I just played around with it, modified it, turned it into this. Another sound that doesn't really sound that interesting by itself, but again, when I pitched it down and added a bunch of notes to make a chord, it sounded like this. I really liked this aesthetic as well. It has kind of like, it's like slightly retro, but still sounds quite modern and unique to me. And then adding layers and processing it, it resulted in the level completion sound. Yeah. And from that point, I wanted to have cohesion in the aesthetic for the UI sounds and all the menu sounds. So I just decided to use that original synth texture and just like keep manipulating it in different ways. And that ended up being like the base layer for many of the sounds. I'll play 4 sounds now, just going from sort of left to right. I don't have videos for them because it'll just take up too much time and I want to get through more stuff. But this is what it sounds like. Yeah, so they're all sounds that came from that original synth texture, even though they like ultimately sounded quite different from each other. But I feel like having that that relevant layer just makes them feel cohesive. So Abyssal Sphere this is a boss in the game. We wanted it to feel like a climactic moment in the game. We wanted it to be really menacing, massive, otherworldly, demonic. It was meant to be, the ultimate moment of the game. we wanted to be an extension of the enemy aesthetic as well. So we didn't want it to sound completely different from what was in there already. So the first sounds I want to go through, the diegetic VO. So diegetic, for anyone that doesn't know, it means, VO is voiceover. Diegetic means that the voiceover is coming from within the game world, as opposed to non-diegetic, which would be like a narrator's voice. So the way I sort of, again, through experimentation, started with like a camel sound. And then I just sort of got a bunch of variations of the camel sound and cross-faded it to make it a longer version. Pitched it down 1 octave, added a bunch of layers, granular processing, and this is kind of the resulting like boss vocal aesthetic. Yeah, so it's a camel. Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I feel like the majority of the things that I do just come from doing random experiments like this, where I'm just throwing sounds and hoping it works. You can see in the photo and the GIFs before, like the abyssal sphere is constantly shooting out these waves of projectiles. Not constantly, but depending on which attacks it's doing. So I wanted to add like a layer of this VO to it, but also add these like projectile sounds. And we wanted the projectile sounds to be not like low in the mix, but quite beefy and an impactful part of the sound. So again, grab the whale grunt. So I took that sound and I just looped a really, really small section of it like this. Nothing special at this point. Pitched it down. And then added a pitch envelope to it, which means that every 120 milliseconds, the pitch would go up 41 semitones, 41 musical notes, and then down in that particular shape. And it would just keep repeating that. And it turned it into this. Which is, you know, I didn't expect getting there from the whale grunt. That was cool. It was cool that it ended up there. Oops. So yeah, I guess from there, the boss has different sequences, and as you progress through the sequences where it does one of the attacks, I called it standard spin because it had a few different types of projectile attacks, and it had 4 different levels. So the good thing about looping the sounds in the way that I did was that you could easily speed it up. And so the higher the level, the more crazy the vocals, and the faster that pitch envelope is changing. And this is how it sounded at the end. Yeah, pretty nuts. So yeah, moving on to heavy weapons. So the heavy weapons, you've got a few different types of weapons that you can use. You've got your pistols, which are your light weapons, and then the heavy weapons, which have 2 types of shots, like the normal primary fire and then the Wrath Blast. Wrath Blast is kind of like a special shot that takes a while to charge up your Wrath bar, and then you can shoot it, and it does a bunch of things that make it, that, you know, that help the knight in getting a high score. We wanted to be particularly unique, feel really powerful, and we wanted the different weapons to sound different, but like also cohesive in terms of this like wrath aesthetic. Here's a GIF of a few different Wrath Blasts, some of the different weapons, and I worked with Matt Dwyer on these sounds. And here are some of the initial iterations that we did. So cool sounds, but they weren't quite where we wanted them to be. We wanted them to be a bit more unique, have a bit more definition in some of the layers, and just overall be more otherworldly, more in line with the Kill Knight aesthetic. So through a lot of experimentation and iteration, this is where we got in the end. Yeah, they were really cool sounds in the end. Really happy with how they turned out. So at this point, I wish I could go through more examples, just do it for an hour straight, but I want to get to some other parts. But yeah, the aesthetic was forming, and the good thing about this is that it just became easier with time. We started being able to refer to our own sounds instead of trying to go through this really complex process of figuring out what kind of sound we actually wanted. And it allowed us to have more confidence with our vision and to continue evolving the ideas further. So once the aesthetic had started forming, started encountering very interesting mixing challenges. Excuse me. Yeah, Kill Knight was a very interesting game to mix. I've never tried to mix anything like it. So players must always hear the right sounds at the right times. This was kind of like the fundamental pillar driving the work behind the mixing and how I approached doing it. So it was challenging for many of these reasons. I guess we wanted the audio to really hit hard, but at the same time, there's like a million sound effects playing at all times. And we also wanted it to feel like a sensory assault, but we also wanted sound effects to sound extremely clear at the same time. There was a lot going on. It was complicated trying to achieve that. The first thing, I guess, which was quite important for me was to understand the order of importance of the different sound effects. And that's what I did with the designers. We sort of went through together all the sounds in the game and tried to understand their importance in relation to each other. It really helped me understand the game better, which subsequently informed how I mixed the game and also how I created sound effects. I'll just quickly go through a few of the hierarchies. This is like the main enemies, where you have 3 different tiers, and within those tiers you have 3 different categories. Fairly standard stuff in terms of like the enemies that you see more frequently, obviously, or not obviously, but in my experience, they're less impactful, less interesting, whereas we wanted the bigger ones to be a lot more interesting and a lot more impactful. Same with the player sounds. The Sword Ultimate, the GIF at the top, is the strongest thing that the player can do in the game. Takes a while to charge up to that point, to charge your sword bar, and then we wanted it to really feel enormous and impactful, and it kind of just shreds anything on screen. Whereas on the other side of the spectrum, the pistol shooting sound, you're doing that like 50% of the time in the game, so we didn't want that to just completely overtake everything else. So it was challenging understanding the compromise for each weapon and for each sound in terms of like where it's sat in the mix. Same with enemy sound effects categories. The most important one for me was the attack telegraphs, because that gives, the attack telegraphs are sort of like when an enemy is charging up an attack or they're about to attack you. So it gives the player information about when they're about to be damaged, potentially. So that was like something that needed to really cut through the chaos, whereas movement loops were far less important for us. Then there were also these critical feedback sounds, which are sort of these special gameplay mechanics in the game that the player can interact with in different ways. And we wanted these to really feel extremely rewarding when the player interacts with them, and they have to always be heard no matter what. So I guess all of understanding the order of importance allowed me to make more informed decisions when it came to like designing the sound effects. And the fundamental audio properties, which is the list on the side, it really did make an enormous difference in allowing certain sounds to be heard in those intense moments of gameplay. I've got an example here with the power gems, which are these little red sort of orbs that you can constantly collect to increase your power level. We wanted them to feel rewarding, but it happens so often that we wanted to make it not that loud. So it was interesting. It was an interesting challenge, not having it be loud, but also having it feel rewarding at the same time. Here's a video with an early iteration versus the last version. Yeah, it really, I mean, they're playing at the exact same volume, but it made such a massive difference just having it more tonal. I found that like noise-based sound effects just got drowned out immediately when there was a lot going on. So that tonality really helped it stick out. And the fact that it just had a lot more high frequencies compared to the first one. So even designing all the assets quite carefully, it still wasn't enough to have a mix that sort of felt good, where sounds weren't getting drowned out by each other, where sounds weren't losing their impact. There's still elements of this happening a lot, and it just wasn't enough to just design the assets properly. So another thing that I did was, I was really OCD about how I structured my mix bus. You can see here that you've got the enemy telegraphs and the critical feedback sounds. They were sort of separated from the rest of the enemy sounds. Initially, I had them as part of the enemy groups, but I was just finding that particularly when there was any side chaining going on, which I'll go into soon, they would just lose a lot of impact. So in separating them, I was able to more easily just manipulate them and keep them above everything else. So yeah, side chaining, I'm just going to go into one or two examples, but I did a little bit of subtle side chaining in that initial mixing image. One of the things said, don't over mix. This was also something that we really wanted to make sure that even in those intense moments, it still felt overwhelming, but there was this fine balance of, overwhelming and just like getting rid of 50% of the sound so you could hear what you were doing. We didn't want to do that. So one of the things that I did was the tier 2 and 3 enemies, when they played sound effects, it would duck the volume of the tier 1 enemies just by 4 decibels, which is not very much, but it was enough to really make quite a significant difference when there's just a lot going on screen. And I don't have an example of this, but in the end video, you hopefully will be able to hear it a little bit. I also did multi-band sidechaining a little bit, I should probably explain for anyone that doesn't know, sidechaining is where when one sound plays, it ducks the volume of another sound, basically, to make room in the mix. And you can also do multi-band sidechaining, where instead of ducking the volume of a sound, you're ducking the volume of just a certain frequency area of the sound. So I did this with a lot of the major UI sounds, like when you get damaged, for example. We want the damage sound is a really impactful sound in Kill Knight. We wanted it to, almost scare the player into playing better. And it's quite bassy. And when there's just a million things going on, what I ended up doing was when that sound plays, it reduces the volume of just the low frequencies of the enemy sounds. So it's a bit less obvious. If it was also the mid and the high frequencies, it would just be more noticeable that the enemy sounds are kind of disappearing. But with the bass, it's just a lot more nuanced. So after doing all of these things, I guess we sort of got it to a point where we were feeling more happy with the sound effects, were feeling more impactful. You could hear the sounds that you were meant to hear at those particular times. And even during intense moments, it still felt like you were being overwhelmed. And now we get to the final part, I guess the end result. I just want to play some gameplay footage from Kill Knight, which sort of has everything that I've talked about up until this point embedded in the game already. I struggled recording that gameplay footage because I suck. But yeah, hopefully that shows some good gameplay. But don't tell the designers; they'll probably be embarrassed. But yeah, thanks for listening to my talk. We've got enough time for some questions for about 8 or so minutes, but also I'll be hanging around at the PlaySide booth afterwards, so if anyone wants to come talk to me, feel free to. But yeah, does anyone have any questions?
So who wrote the music?
The music was done by 3 people. So a guy named Finn Cooney did all the combat music, and Filmmaker, who was an artist that lives in Colombia, he did the main menu theme. And we also got Tom, who works at PlaySide, to do the boss music.
Did you have any conversations with them in that process?
Yeah.
In regards to how you integrate everything?
Yeah, it's a good question. I wanted to add something about that in the slide, but I took it out in the end because I just felt like I didn't have enough time. But it was really interesting working with composers, particularly ones that weren't even within PlaySide, because it was, I guess, it was a difficult, as I've said a million times, it was challenging to understand what the actual vision was, and that was a lot harder for people that weren't like completely immersed in the process. So that was a really interesting experience and a challenging experience to like get the composers to sort of see it in the way that we saw it. But I guess the way we went about that was a lot of iteration and a lot of conversations and just trying to be as objective as possible when trying to like explain to them what we're talking about. Yeah. Yeah, always. Yeah.
Were the sound effects being designed in parallel with the animations and particle effects?
Yeah, a lot of the time when I made the sound effects, I would sort of take videos or have videos given to me, and I would import them into my DAW, like Ableton or Reaper, and just kind of like make it alongside the videos so they sort of felt right from a timing sense. Yeah. Hey.
Just if anyone does have any more questions, we do have a microphone.
Oh yeah, cool. True. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Do you have a question?
Can you replay the last video again?
You want me to replay? Yeah, sure. Sure. Yeah. Yeah, it's, I was hoping, I don't know how these speakers are, but hopefully. Okay, that's good. It's probably a bit loud, but. One more time? Yeah, if there are no more questions, no more. Yeah, do you have a question?
Yeah, in terms of how much control are you going to give to like the player in terms of like sound settings to like
Yeah.
adjust the sound?
Very
So
minimal
it's
in Kill
minimal?
Knight. Yeah, just sound effects and music, basically. Yeah.
Cool.
We just kind of wanted to, we had a discussion about that, but we felt there wasn't really that much of a need to do it. I mean, I'm sure there could be a good argument made that it'd be nice for players to have more control, but I think in the sort of arcade aesthetic, we felt that it wasn't really necessary.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, no worries. Hey.
Just, you really do notice how
I didn't do that, I promise.
you notice how valuable that ducking effect is.
Yeah.
Now you've played it out.
Yeah.
You did that all through FMOD?
Yeah, everything, all the implementation was done with FMOD. And yeah, there was quite a lot of ducking in the game. It was kind of ended up being this complex web of ducking where I thought I was going a bit crazy at some point. But yeah, I sort of just, I thought about it in a few different ways. Ultimately, I had like high, medium, and low priority sounds. The medium priority was kind of like when you get damaged or when something really epic happens. And the low priority was like pretty much everything else. High priority ended up only having like 1 or 2 sounds in there, which is like meant to be when you achieve a reward or something, and it's just meant to duck absolutely everything. But that helped me understand that process and just kind of make it feel a bit more efficient. And then within the low priority bus, I had, enemies ducking, like large enemies ducking smaller enemies. I had like certain player actions ducking the enemies as well. And like everything was sort of ducking each other a little bit, which obviously, not obviously, but it required testing to make sure that it wouldn't just like crap out the game, especially on Switch. I was surprised with how much I could get away with on Switch actually. But, yeah. Hey.
For the enemy telegraphs,
Yeah.
what were some of the things you were thinking about when like designing those to like both fit the animation and also give the feeling of like dodge now kind of thing?
Yeah, that's a good question. I wish I could show some earlier examples of some of those sounds because they were cool sounds, but they would just completely get drowned out. So some of the attack telegraph sounds are like, in order for me to get them to stand out more, they look like bricks, like the waveforms. I really like compressed the hell out of them and made sure they had a lot of high frequencies, and also made sure they had really obvious like tonality in them, because I found that the tonality was what really cut through when there's so much going on. Yeah. Thanks. Hey.
Were there any tools or systems that you had to request from the engineers on your team, or was there anything that you wish you had received from them?
That's also a good question. I have to think. I mean, ultimately FMOD allowed me to do a lot, but there were a lot of cases where in order for me to get certain functionality, I had to request it from the programmers. So for example, the power gems, when you collect power gems, that bar at the very top, it sort of fills up as you collect power gems. The power gem sound is quieter when the less of a bar you have filled. So it's a minor change where it gets louder over time, but like I was only able to do that if the programmers provided me like essentially a game parameter that I could then just like map to volume for that sound. So there's a lot of that. It's mostly game parameters and stuff. So I'd love to answer your question, but I've just gotten the time flag. Come and chat to me afterwards if you want to have a chat. But yeah, thanks everyone so much for